In the harsh winter of 1943, a group of trappers came upon an old, weather-beaten cabin. They expected nothing more than a quiet, empty shelter. But when they opened the door, they were stunned. Inside, lying barely conscious on the floor, was a man on the edge of death, clothes tattered, fingers blackened from frostbite, and his body skeletal from starvation. His eyes, however, held a faint spark of life. The trappers had found Leon Crane, a young Army Air Forces lieutenant who, against unimaginable odds, had survived nearly 3 months alone in Alaska's brutal wilderness. On December 21, 1943, Lieutenant Leon Crane, just 22 years old, prepared for what was expected to be a standard test flight. A young but skilled flight engineer and co-pilot, Crane was accustomed to high-stakes missions. However, this mission was unique, not because of its danger, but because of the seemingly simple objective to test the performance of their B-24 Liberator bomber in extreme cold. The plane, affectionately named Iceberg Inez, had flown many missions, but today's flight over Alaska's vast wilderness would be a trial of its endurance in the harsh winter temperatures. Crane was joined by 4 crew members: Lieutenant Harold Hoskins, a seasoned pilot who had flown countless missions; Flight Engineer Ralph Wins, whose technical expertise on board was critical; Gunner Francis Breadbenner, known for his nerves of steel in combat; and Tech Sergeant Benjamin Franklin, the radio man whose skills had saved them in the past. These men were used to facing combat, but on that freezing December day, they had no idea that they would soon be facing a very different, relentless enemy. The flight began smoothly as Iceberg Inez soared over the Alaskan wilderness, her engines roaring against the icy blue sky. Inside the cockpit, Crane and Hoskins monitored the controls while the others tended to their respective stations. But as they climbed higher, the frigid air began to tighten its grip on the bomber, and soon they noticed slight fluctuations in the engine. The cold was beyond anything they had anticipated, and Iceberg Inez seemed to be struggling against the Arctic chill. Suddenly, a terrible stutter shook the aircraft. The engines sputtered, coughing as if they were suffocating. Within seconds, what had been minor fluctuations became a catastrophic failure. The engines failed completely, leaving the men in deafening silence. Panic washed over the crew as they realized they were now in a powerless descent. "Brace yourselves!" Lieutenant Hoskins shouted, trying to maintain control, but it was too late. The bomber began to spiral, plummeting toward the snowy expanse below. The airmen scrambled for the exits, struggling against the sheer force of the descent. Amid the chaos, Crane made a split-second decision that would seal his fate. Desperate to escape, he leapt from the aircraft, tumbling through the air as the plane hurtled downward with his crewmates still on board. He watched in horror as the bomber became a dark speck against the white landscape, disappearing into the dense forest below. Crane's parachute opened, slowing his descent as he drifted toward the ground. When he finally landed, he sank knee-deep into the snow, disoriented and alone in the bitter cold. The quiet that surrounded him was as profound as it was eerie. No wreckage, no signs of his crewmates, just endless miles of frozen wilderness stretching in every direction. He was unprepared for the brutal Alaskan winter. His uniform, designed for cockpit temperatures but not for life in the open wilderness, was frighteningly inadequate. The temperature had already dropped below 45 degrees Celsius, and he had little to protect him from the deadly chill. With only a thin jacket, gloves, and his standard-issue boots, Crane knew his survival was against incredible odds. Nightfall came swiftly, enveloping him in a darkness so profound that it felt like a suffocating blanket. Alone under the endless Alaskan sky, Crane battled to stay awake, fearing that sleep would mean death. He could feel his strength draining with each minute that passed. The relentless cold gnawed at his exposed skin, and his body began to shake uncontrollably. But he knew he had to keep moving if he wanted to survive even a single night in these conditions. In the days that followed, Crane's struggle against the cold became a merciless test of endurance. His body, unaccustomed to the extreme cold, began to feel the effects of frostbite. His fingers and toes were numb, and his face was raw from the biting wind. He searched for shelter, but the vast expanse of white provided little in the way of protection or comfort. His initial hopes of being rescued began to fade as each hour passed. The realization settled in, he was truly on his own. With no sign of his crewmates, no wreckage to mark his location, and no supplies, Crane's chances of survival dwindled with each frozen step. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass, and his limbs were heavy with exhaustion. The snow around him seemed endless, stretching like a white desert, cold and empty. As hunger gnawed at him, Crane was forced to ration his limited provisions, scouring the area for anything remotely edible. His thoughts drifted to his fallen comrades, wondering if any had survived the crash. But the bleak reality weighed heavily on him. He was likely the only one left. After what felt like an eternity of wandering, Crane stumbled upon a sight that felt almost like a mirage in the snow. A small, weathered trapper's cabin. It was modest, nothing more than a wooden shack with a small stove and a few weather-beaten supplies, but to Crane, it was salvation. Exhausted and half-frozen, he collapsed inside, lighting a fire and feeling the warmth thaw his aching body. Inside, he found a small stockpile of canned goods. The food, though stale and sparse, was a godsend. For the first time since he'd landed, Crane allowed himself to rest, relishing the warmth of the fire and the temporary safety the cabin provided. Yet he knew he couldn't stay here indefinitely. The small stash wouldn't last long, and the cabin was too far off the beaten path for rescuers to ever find him. As the fire crackled, Crane plotted his next move. He would have to leave the relative comfort of the cabin and venture back into the wilderness to find help. The thought of returning to the unforgiving cold sent a shiver down his spine, but he knew it was his only option if he wanted to survive. In the days that followed, Crane resumed his trek through the snow, his body growing weaker with each passing day. He faced constant battles with hypothermia and frostbite, his skin blistering and peeling as the cold attacked him. His fingers, now blackened from frostbite, throbbed with pain, and his feet ached with every step. The landscape around him became a silent antagonist, beautiful yet deadly. The quiet of the snow-covered wilderness was broken only by the crunch of his own footsteps, a lonely sound in an otherwise lifeless expanse. The isolation gnawed at his mind, and he began to feel as though he were trapped in a nightmare, wandering through an endless sea of snow with no end in sight. The cold was unrelenting, and his body began to deteriorate rapidly. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the air before him, each exhalation a reminder of how close he was to his breaking point. Yet despite the pain, he pressed on, driven by a sheer, unbreakable will to survive. After 81 days of battling the elements, Crane was on the verge of collapse. His body was ravaged, frostbitten, and malnourished. He had lost track of time, his mind numb from exhaustion and isolation. Just as he was nearing the edge of his endurance, he came upon a second trapper's cabin. With his last reserves of strength, he managed to reach the cabin and collapsed on its threshold. Inside, he found temporary relief, but his ordeal wasn't over. It was there that a group of trappers discovered him, astounded to find a man so close to death yet still alive. The trappers took Crane in, nursing him back to health and marveling at the strength it had taken to survive the Alaskan wilderness for nearly 3 months alone. Emaciated and blackened from frostbite, Crane's story became one of legendary resilience. Leon Crane's survival story spread through the military, inspiring advancements in cold weather survival training. Though haunted by the loss of his friends and the brutal memories of his ordeal, Crane's story remains a testament to human resilience against unimaginable odds. Thank you for watching this video. Hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more interesting videos.